The locksmith's drill screamed through the deadbolt at 6:47 a.m. Margaret Kane, 72 years old, stood on the sidewalk in her nightgown watching her own daughter change the locks. "You're a liability, Mom," Bryn said before driving away without looking back. 3 hours later, Margaret stood at a county auction clutching $75, everything she had left. The auctioneer smirked. "Abandoned Hell's Angels Clubhouse. Minimum bid $75. Anyone crazy enough?" Her hand went up. That night, sleeping on concrete surrounded by faded photographs of men in leather, Margaret heard them. Motorcycle engines. Getting closer. They come back. And she just bought their history. Before we continue, if you believe people deserve dignity at every age, hit that subscribe button right now. Like this video and comment where you're watching from. Your support keeps these stories alive. Now, let's enjoy the story together. Margaret Kane stood on the sidewalk in her nightgown, barefoot on cold concrete, watching a stranger erase her from the only home she had left. Kevin didn't look at her, didn't acknowledge her presence 10 feet away. Just worked methodically, professionally, like he was changing locks on a rental property, not the house where his mother-in-law had lived for 2 years. The house she'd helped buy with the life insurance money from Tom's death. The house that was supposed to be temporary until she got back on her feet. The drill stopped. Kevin pocketed the old keys, her keys, and tested the new lock. Click. The sound echoed louder than it should have. Final. Belmano. Margaret's daughter Bryn appeared in the doorway then, arms crossed over her pristine blazer, face arranged into the expression she probably used in court. Cold. Calculated. Stripped of anything resembling mercy. "Mom," not a greeting, a statement of fact, an acknowledgement of biology, nothing more. Margaret opened her mouth, but no words came. What do you say to your own child when they're erasing you? When they've decided you're not worth the inconvenience anymore? "We talked about this," Bryn continued, her voice carrying that particular tone of forced patience that made Margaret's skin crawl. "You're becoming a liability. The wandering at night, the stove incidents. We can't do this anymore." "I don't wander," Margaret said quietly, her voice sounding small even to her own ears. "I check the doors. Lock them, like your father taught me. You checked them 7 times last Tuesday, Mom." Kevin counted. Of course he did. Kevin counted everything, measured everything, quantified Margaret's existence down to the number of times she performed a ritual that had kept her sane since Tom died. Since the man who'd survived 2 tours in Vietnam, who'd earned a Purple Heart saving 3 of his unit, had lost his battle with cancer in their bedroom at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday. The checking wasn't paranoia. It was grief wearing a safety protocol uniform, but explaining that to Bryn would require her daughter to see Margaret as human. And that ship had sailed sometime around the 2nd year of living together, when Margaret's presence had shifted from temporary solution to permanent problem. The moving truck idled at the curb, its engine rumbling like a threat. Margaret hadn't noticed it before. Now she couldn't look away. Inside that truck were her things, the photographs spanning 50 years of marriage, Tom's Purple Heart in its velvet case, the quilt her grandmother had stitched in 1943 while her grandfather fought in the Pacific, the books Margaret had collected over 40 years of reading to children who couldn't read themselves. Everything that proved she'd existed, that she'd mattered, that she'd built a life worth remembering, all compressed into boxes labeled in Bryn's neat, efficient handwriting. "Mom stuff, donate. Not keep, not storage, donate." As if Margaret's entire existence could be written off as a tax deduction. "The truck leaves in 10 minutes, Bryn said, checking her watch. "A Rolex. Gift from Kevin last Christmas." Margaret had given her a hand-knitted scarf that Bryn wore exactly once for the obligatory thank you photo before it disappeared into whatever void consumed unwanted gifts. "Where am I supposed to go?" Margaret heard herself ask, hating the tremor in her voice, the weakness it revealed. Bryn's expression flickered. Not quite guilt, more like irritation at being asked to acknowledge the logistics of abandonment. They're facilities, Mom. Places designed for people who need assistance. Facilities. The word landed like a slap. Bryn meant nursing homes, warehouses for the elderly, places where people went to wait for death while watching television in communal rooms that smelled like disinfectant and despair. Margaret was 72 years old, not senile, not incapacitated, not ready to be filed away like outdated paperwork. At 72, you think you felt every kind of pain. Childbirth, the death of parents, burying a spouse. You think your capacity for hurt has reached its limit, that your heart has calloused over, that nothing can reach the tender parts anymore. You're wrong. There's a specific agony reserved for being erased by your own blood, for watching someone who shared your body, who you fed and clothed and loved with a ferocity that bordered on violence, decide you're not worth the inconvenience anymore, that your existence has become a burden they're no longer willing to carry. The moving truck pulled away at 7:03 a.m. Margaret watched it disappear around the corner, taking everything she owned, everything that connected her to a life that felt increasingly like it had happened to someone else. Bryn retreated inside without another word. The new lock clicked behind her. Margaret stood on the sidewalk in her nightgown, holding nothing but her purse, the one she grabbed on instinct when Kevin had knocked on her bedroom door at 6:30 and told her she needed to step outside for a moment. Inside that purse, her wallet with $75 in bills, her ID, a photograph of Tom she'd tucked in that morning, some instinct she hadn't understood telling her to keep it close, and her phone, the cheap prepaid one Bryn had insisted she carry after the library let her go. The library, Roosevelt Branch, where Margaret had worked part-time for 3 years after retiring from a real job. Shelving books, helping children find stories, existing in a space that still valued her knowledge, her patience, her ability to make a scared 7-year-old feel brave enough to check out their first chapter book. They'd restructured her out 2 months ago. Budget cuts, they said. Need to bring in younger volunteers, they meant. People who worked for free. People who didn't need the $600 a month that made the difference between Margaret maintaining a shred of independence and becoming completely reliant on her daughter's charity. Charity. That's what Bryn had called it. We're doing you a favor, Mom. The least you could do is appreciate it. Margaret started walking, not toward anything, just away. Away from the locked door. Away from the house that had stopped being home the moment that drill started screaming. Away from her daughter's cold calculations and her son-in-law's counting. The September air was cool, but not cold. Margaret's nightgown, thin cotton, modest, the kind elderly women wore because comfort mattered more than appearance, offered little protection, but she barely noticed. The cold she felt wasn't coming from the weather. It was radiating from somewhere deep in her chest, spreading outward like frost on a window, numbing everything it touched. 3 blocks later, Margaret found herself at the diner, the same one where she and Tom used to eat breakfast every Sunday after church. Before the cancer, before everything. She pushed through the door, the bell jingling overhead, a sound that belonged to a different life, a different Margaret who had money and purpose and somewhere to go after eating. The waitress was new, or maybe not. Margaret couldn't remember anymore. Faces blurred together when you stopped matching. The woman's name tag read Shanice. She looked at Margaret's nightgown, her bare feet, her 2 bright eyes, and something in her expression softened. Coffee? Shanice asked gently. Margaret nodded, sliding into a booth near the back. The vinyl seat cracked under her weight, familiar and foreign all at once. The coffee came black and hot. Margaret wrapped her hands around the cup, needing something to hold, something real and solid and warm. That's when she saw the newspaper. Someone had left it folded on the table, open to the classifieds. Public notices, county auctions, farm equipment and vacant lots and items nobody wanted being sold to anyone desperate or foolish enough to bid. Margaret's eyes scanned automatically. Teacher's habit, never quite broken. Reading everything absorbing information without thinking about why. Then she stopped. Her finger traced a line near the bottom of the page. County auction, today, 10 a.m., courthouse steps asterisk. Item number 47. 1847, Hollister Road. Former private clubhouse. Abandoned since 2009. Structural concerns. Sold as is. No warranties. No inspections. Property carries significant history and reputation. Minimum bid, $75, asterisk. $75. Margaret had exactly $75. She circled the listing with a pen Shanice had left on the table. Her handwriting was shaky, uncertain, but deliberate. What Margaret didn't know, what she couldn't know, sitting in that diner booth with her coffee and her $75 and her newspaper, was that this decision would change everything. That 1847 Hollister Road had secrets buried in its foundation. That 350 Hells Angels had lived there over 4 decades, and some of them were still looking for what they'd left behind. That buying this house would put a target on her back. That powerful men would try to destroy her to protect their reputations. And that Margaret Kane, dismissed and discarded and invisible, was about to become impossible to ignore. But first, she had to survive the auction. And what happened there would set everything else in motion. The county courthouse smelled like dust and bureaucracy, like every important decision made in rooms that hadn't seen fresh air in decades. Morning light filtered through tall windows, turning the air golden and deceptive, like the room might offer something better than it actually contained. Margaret arrived 30 minutes early. She sat in the back row of folding chairs, her purse clutched against her ribs like armor. The $75 inside represented both salvation and gamble. If she lost this auction, she had nothing. If she won it, she'd own a house she'd never seen, in a condition she couldn't predict, with a history the auctioneer had called significant. People filtered in slowly. Farmers in work boots, hands calloused and patient, eyes scanning the auction list with the practiced assessment of men who knew the value of land. A real estate investor in an expensive suit, Rex Holloway, according to the whispers, who moved through the room like a predator calculating profit margins before items even hit the block. And Margaret, 72 years old, homeless, wearing the same clothes she'd slept in at the diner after Shanice had quietly let her stay past closing, pretending not to notice Margaret had nowhere else to go. The auctioneer took his position at the podium, a thin man with a voice that had announced tragedy and triumph too many times to differentiate anymore. He shuffled papers with practiced indifference, eyes already glazed with the boredom of repetition. Farm equipment went first. A vintage tractor sparked a minor bidding war that ended at $1,200. Margaret watched the money change hands and felt her stomach clench. $1,200. She had 75. A vacant lot near the highway brought out Rex Holloway, who wanted it $3,000 after 2 farmers dropped out. Each gavel strike felt like a countdown to the moment that would define whether Margaret slept indoors or on the street tonight. The room had thinned when the auctioneer's voice cut through the murmur. Next item, 1847, Hollister Road. Former private clubhouse. Abandoned since 2009. Structural concerns unknown. Sold as is. No warranties. No inspections permitted prior to sale. He paused, glancing at his notes. The property carries significant history and local reputation. Minimum bid $75. A few people chuckled. Someone muttered something about Hell's Angels that Margaret couldn't quite hear but understood from the tone. Dangerous. Notorious. A place decent people avoided. Rex Holloway's hand started to rise, interest flickering across his face. Probably saw potential in the land value, in tearing down whatever wreckage existed and building something profitable. Margaret's voice came out louder than she'd intended. Clear. Definite. $75. The room went quiet. Not dramatic silence, just a natural pause of people trying to understand what they just witnessed. The auctioneer looked up, found her in the back row, surprise flickering across his weathered face. Around her, heads turned. The farmer studied her with something between pity and confusion. Rex Holloway lowered his hand, reassessing, his sharp investor's mind clearly calculating whether this elderly woman knew something he didn't. "Ma'am," the auctioneer said slowly, his voice carrying genuine concern now. "Are you aware of the property's history? Hell's Angels Motorcycle Club owned this building from 1968 to 2009. Approximately 350 members passed through over those years. The property has a certain reputation in the community." Margaret met his eyes, held them. "I am aware. $75. More murmurs. Someone chuckled again. Not cruelly, but with the disbelief reserved for people who don't understand the game they're playing, who don't know they're supposed to be afraid. Rex Holloway turned fully to look at her now, eyes narrowing in assessment. Then he shrugged and waved dismissively. "Not worth the hassle," he muttered to the man beside him. "Foundation's probably compromised. Tear-down costs would eat any profit." The auctioneer scanned the room one final time. "Any other bids? Anyone?" Silence answered him. Thick. Final. Sold to the lady in the back row for $75. The gavel came down with a sound that felt both hollow and monumental, like a door closing and opening simultaneously. Everyone in that room assumed Margaret Kane was confused, maybe desperate, definitely making a mistake no rational person would make. An elderly woman buying a Hell's Angels clubhouse with her last $75. None of them knew she'd spent 30 years as a social worker before becoming a librarian, that she'd worked with at-risk youth in the toughest neighborhoods, that she'd faced down gang members, broken up knife fights, talked suicidal teenagers off literal and metaphorical ledges. She'd handled rougher crowds than bikers, or so she thought. The taxi cost $18. Margaret watched the meter climb with each mile, anxiety knotting tighter in her stomach as her remaining $57 shrank with each passing minute. The driver, an older man named Frank who'd seen enough to ask no questions, followed roads that thinned from asphalt to gravel to barely there tracks cutting through dead prairie grass, turned brown with approaching autumn. "There it is," Frank said, pointing ahead. Margaret leaned forward, squinting through the windshield. The house rose from the landscape like something the earth had tried to swallow and failed. 2 stories of faded red brick, windows boarded over with plywood weathered to the color of old bones. A massive garage sat attached to the side, big enough for a dozen vehicles, its rolling door decorated with a painted skull wearing a winged helmet. The Hell's Angels Death Head logo, faded by sun and rain, but unmistakable in its defiance. Frank pulled up to what had once been a gravel parking lot. Weeds had reclaimed most of it, pushing through cracks, reaching waist-high in places, creating a barrier between the road and the building. "You sure about this, ma'am?" His voice carried genuine concern, not judgment. Margaret paid him, watching her money shrink to $39. "I'm sure. Thank you." He drove away slowly, like he expected her to change her mind and run after him, flag him down before it was too late. She didn't. She stood there in the cold September afternoon, holding her purse and the deed they'd given her at the courthouse, and looked at what $75 had bought her. The front door was metal, painted black years ago, rust now flaking under her palm when she touched the handle. It resisted at first, hinges protesting decades of disuse, then groaned open with a sound that echoed into the darkness beyond. The smell hit her immediately. A physical wave that made her step back, hand covering her nose and mouth. Motor oil, thick and ancient, soaked into concrete and wood until it became part of the structure itself. Old leather, the kind that had absorbed decades of sweat and smoke and living. And underneath it all, decay, sweet and patient. The smell of time itself, rotting in abandoned spaces. Margaret forced herself to step inside. Her eyes adjusted slowly to the dimness. The main room stretched 50 feet across, maybe more. Concrete floors, cracked but fundamentally solid, ran wall to wall. A bar dominated one side, bottles still on the shelves. Most empty, some broken, glass glittering in weak light, filtering through gaps in the boarded windows. Tables bolted to the floor bore scars of decades. Initials carved deep. Cigarette burns creating constellations of damage. In the corner, a pool table sagged under a thick layer of dust. Its green felt faded to the color of old money. But it was the walls that stopped Margaret's breath. Names everywhere, carved into wood paneling, written in permanent marker, scratched into layers of paint with knives or keys or fingernails desperate to leave a mark. Writer, 1975. Stitch, rest in peace, brother. Gone, but never forgotten. We ride forever. Brothers to the end. Hundreds of signatures. Dates spanning decades. Each one a ghost of someone who'd stood exactly where she stood now. Someone who'd claimed this space as sacred, as theirs. Photographs covered patches of wall, stuck with thumbtacks gone rusty with age. Groups of men on motorcycles, arms slung around each other's shoulders, leather vests decorated with patches Margaret didn't understand but could feel the weight of. Funeral processions, lines of bikes stretching into distance. Parties where everyone smiled like they knew something the camera couldn't capture. And in almost every photo, the same figure appeared. An older man, gray-bearded even then, eyes kind despite the scars visible on his knuckles, despite the hardness the world had carved into his face. Someone had written across the bottom of one photo in careful, reverent script, Grizz, President 1985 to 2009. Leather vests hung from hooks near the door like ghosts waiting for bodies to fill them. Arms hanging empty, patches faded but still proclaiming allegiance to something bigger than individual lives. Margaret reached out slowly, touched one. The leather was cold, stiff with age, but still holding the shape of whoever had worn it last. Still remembering. These were people she thought. Real people. They laughed here, fought here, loved here, lived here. She explored slowly, her footsteps echoing in the emptiness. Behind the bar, broken glass crunched underfoot, remnants of final drinks or forgotten fights. In a back corner, she found a bathroom with a cracked mirror and a sink that might still work if the water was connected. Upstairs, she discovered smaller rooms, maybe for sleeping or private conversations, all stripped bare except for graffiti on the walls. Messages and memories and goodbyes scratched in a plaster. Grizz saved my life. Wrecker 89. Nobody rides alone. We were family when the world said we were nothing. Then Margaret found the basement door. Heavy oak, reinforced with metal strips bolted across its face. A padlock held it shut, industrial grade, the kind used to protect something valuable or dangerous. Chain wrapped through the handle, thick links gone orange with rust. Someone hadn't just locked this door. They'd sealed it, made certain it would take real effort to open. Whatever they'd locked down there, they hadn't wanted it found, or they'd wanted to make sure only the right people could find it. Margaret stood staring at the door for a long moment, exhaustion creeping through her bones like cold water. Tomorrow, she decided, she'd deal with tomorrow's mysteries tomorrow. Tonight, she just needed to survive. She found the cleanest corner she could, a spot near the far wall, away from the broken glass and the worst of the debris. She used her coat as a blanket, folding it carefully before lying down on the cold concrete. Her body ached in ways that made inventory painful. Heat, lower back, shoulders, knees. Every joint announced its displeasure at being asked to sleep on stone. She'd bought crackers at a gas station with her last few dollars. 6 crackers for dinner. She ate them slowly, one at a time, chewing thoroughly, trying to convince her stomach this constituted a meal. The house groaned around her as temperature dropped. Wind pushed through gaps in the boarded windows, finding every crack, every separation in the structure. Somewhere above, something rattled. Metal on metal. A sound that could have been threatening or could have been nothing. Margaret found candles behind the bar, likely left over from power outages or kept deliberately for ambience. She lit one, watched the small flame push back darkness just enough to make her feel less alone. Memories came uninvited. Tom teaching her how to check locks. His patience when she asked him to show her again to make sure she understood. "You're tougher than you look, Maggie," he'd said. "People underestimate you. That's their mistake." She wondered if he'd say that now, seeing her curled on concrete in a building that smelled like decades-old mistakes. The candle burned lower. Margaret closed her eyes, not sleeping, just resting them. 2 o'clock in the morning arrived without announcement. Margaret jolted awake to sound. Distant at first, so faint she thought she'd imagined it. Thought it was part of a dream already fading. Then louder. Building. The unmistakable rumble of motorcycle engines. Multiple. The sound growing like thunder rolling across empty plains, getting closer with each second. Her heart kicked against her ribs, sudden and hard. Headlights swept across the walls through gaps in the boarded windows. White light cutting through darkness like searchlights hunting prisoners. The engines cut off one by one, each silence adding weight to the moment. Then boots on gravel. Heavy, purposeful, multiple sets. Voices followed. Male. Low. Words she couldn't make out, but tones she understood perfectly. They weren't asking permission. They weren't uncertain. They'd come home, and Margaret had just bought their history. Margaret had two choices: hide in the shadows and hope they didn't find her, or stand, walk to that door, and claim the house she'd bought for $75 as hers. At 72, hiding felt like surrender, and Margaret had surrendered enough for one lifetime. Her home, her dignity, her place in her daughter's life. She wouldn't surrender this, not without standing up first. She pushed herself to her feet, knees protesting with sharp complaints that she ignored. Walked to the front door, each step deliberate despite the trembling in her hands. The metal handle was cold under her palm. She took one breath, then pulled the door open. Cold air rushed in, carrying the smell of leather and exhaust, and something else, something like Brotherhood or history or ghosts come home. 3 motorcycles sat in a semicircle in the gravel lot, chrome catching moonlight, engines ticking as they cooled. 3 men stood near them, leather vests over heavy jackets, patches she couldn't read in the darkness but could feel the weight of. Hell's Angels. Not the idea of them, not the reputation or the legend. Real men, real bikers. The one in front was maybe 65, gray beard braided down his chest. Face weathered like old wood left too long in the elements, carved with lines that spoke of hard living and harder choices. Scars traced his knuckles, visible even in the dim light. But his eyes, those weren't cruel. They were careful, assessing. The eyes of someone who'd learned to read danger before it arrived, who'd survived by staying alert. The other 2 flanked him, younger but not young, both carrying themselves with the same watchful stillness, like men who'd seen violence and knew exactly what it looked like before it started. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then the lead biker's eyes moved past Margaret, into the clubhouse behind her. His expression did something complicated. Pain and memory and grief all colliding in the space of a heartbeat. "Didn't know anyone bought the place," he said finally. His voice was rough, gravelly, but not hostile. Surprised more than anything. Margaret squared her shoulders, forced her voice steady despite her racing heart. "As of yesterday morning, I did." He studied her then, really looked at her, taking in her age, her obvious exhaustion, the absurdity of an elderly woman standing in the doorway of their former clubhouse at 2 in the morning. "You know what this place was?" he asked. "I know exactly what it was." Margaret's voice came out steadier than she felt. "It's my home now." One of the others stepped forward, younger, maybe 50, muscles visible even under his jacket. Lady, no disrespect, but this is sacred ground to us. You don't understand what you bought. Margaret didn't back down. Then you should have bought it. Everything in this house came with the deed. It's all mine legally. The lead biker raised one hand, a gesture that stopped the younger one immediately, like flipping a switch. He turned back to Margaret, something shifting in his expression. Ma'am, we're not here to scare you. He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. I can see we did anyway, and I apologize for that. But brothers died in this clubhouse. Good men. We come back every year. November 3rd, anniversary of something important. Margaret softened slightly, curiosity overriding fear. What's November 3rd? The man's jaw tightened. Emotion flickered across his weathered face. The day we lost our president. Died right inside. 20 years ago tomorrow. Heart attack. We found him in the morning. He gestured toward the building behind her. Right there at that bar you probably saw. Grizz. His name was Grizz. His memories in those walls. In every name carved there. That's why we come back. To remember. To pay respects. Understanding dawned. Margaret looked at the three men standing in front of her, saw them differently now. Not threats. Mourners. Men who'd lost someone important and had nowhere else to grieve. You can come in, she said finally, but you knock first, and you tell me what you're looking for. This is still my home. The bikers exchanged glances, surprise evident even in the darkness. The leader, the one with the gray beard, studied Margaret with new interest, then nodded slowly. Deal. He extended his hand. Name's Wrecker. That's Gage and Ratchet. Margaret shook his hand. His grip was firm but careful, aware of her age and fragility. Margaret Kane. She stepped back, let them enter. Let them walk past her into the building where their president had died, where their brotherhood had been forged and tested and ultimately ended. Inside, with candles lit, the space felt different. Less abandoned, more alive with memory. Wrecker moved through the room like a man walking through his own past. His fingers traced the bar where Grizz had died, touched names on the wall with reverence reserved for gravestones. We haven't been back since he died, Wrecker said quietly. Club disbanded after. Scattered. Some of us stayed local. Most didn't. Gage, the muscular one, had found the photographs on the wall. He stood staring at one in particular. Three men on motorcycles, arms around each other, all smiling like they owned the world. That was 92, he said, voice thick. Before everything got complicated. Margaret watched them, understanding growing. These weren't dangerous men. They were broken ones. Carrying grief they had no permission to express anywhere else. What are you really looking for? She asked. The three men exchanged looks. Some silent communication passing between them. Wrecker spoke first. Grizz told me something before he died. Said if anything happened to him, everything we needed would be in the foundation. I thought he meant money. Thought maybe he'd stash cash from club business, something to help us when things got rough. He gestured around the room. We've been back 3 times over the years. Looked everywhere. Never found anything. Now we're out of options. Gage has stage 3 cancer. Needs treatment he can't afford. We thought. He trailed off, looking almost embarrassed. We thought maybe the new owner might let us search one last time. Margaret felt something shift in her chest. She walked to where she'd left her purse, pulled out the small notebook she'd found in the leather jacket upstairs. Is this what you're looking for? Wrecker's eyes widened. He took the notebook with shaking hands, opened it carefully like it might disintegrate. His face transformed as he read. This is Grizz's handwriting. These are from 2008, 2009. Right before he died. He read aloud, voice cracking. They can't know about the cargo. 350 brothers, 27 safe houses, 0 failures. If anything happens to me, check the foundation. Wrecker looked up at Margaret, tears streaming down his weathered face. The cargo. Christ, I'd almost forgotten. What cargo? Margaret asked. Gage and Ratchet had moved closer now, both staring at the notebook like it held the answers to questions they'd been asking for 20 years. Recker's voice was barely a whisper. We ran an underground railroad. For kids. The words hung in the air between them. From 1975 to 2009, he continued. Hell's Angels rescued runaway teenagers. Abused kids. Addicted kids. Kids fleeing trafficking or violence or situations nobody should survive. 350 bikers rotated through this clubhouse over those years. Each one helped 10, 20 kids. Maybe more. His hands shook holding the notebook. We saved over 3,000 children. And nobody knows. Margaret felt her breath catch. Why keep it secret? Because some of those kids grew up to be powerful. Ratchet spoke for the first time, his voice hard. Judges. Politicians. CEOs. People who don't want anyone knowing they came from abuse or streets or addiction. People who've built careers on being tough on crime, on demonizing organizations like ours. Gage added, one in particular. Preston Carver, district attorney now. He was 14 when Grizz pulled him off the streets in '87. Kid was running from a stepfather who was going to kill him. Grizz saved his life, got him to relatives who actually gave a damn. Carver's built his whole career on law and order, Recker said bitterly. On being hard on biker clubs, on gangs, on anyone who doesn't fit his version of respectable society. If proof exists that he was a runaway, saved by Hell's Angels, it destroys everything. His reputation, his career, his carefully constructed image. Margaret's mind was racing. And you think that proof is here, in the foundation? Grizz kept records, Recker said. Photos, names, dates, everything. He was meticulous. Said someday people would need to know the truth. That we weren't monsters. We were men trying to do something good in a world that had written us off as worthless. The four of them stood in silence for a moment, the weight of 34 years of secret heroism pressing down on them. Show me, Margaret said finally. The basement door resisted at first. 20 years of rust and neglect fighting against their efforts. But Recker had brought tools. Bolt cutters that made short work of the industrial padlock. The chain fell away with a clatter that echoed in the darkness. Recker pulled the door open. Hinges shrieked. Stale air rushed out, thick with the smell of concrete and time. Flashlight beams cut through the gloom as they descended stairs that creaked under their weight. The basement was larger than Margaret expected. Unfinished concrete. Support beams holding up the floor above. Shadows gathering in corners the light couldn't quite reach. Old furniture sat covered in dust. Boxes lined one wall. Club records, meeting notes, financial ledgers from decades of operation. But it was the far wall that made them all stop. Photographs. Hundreds of them, covering the concrete from floor to ceiling. But these weren't like the ones upstairs. These weren't bikers and motorcycles and parties. These were children. Teenagers, really. Young faces marked by hard living, by streets and drugs and abuse. Each photo was dated, labeled in careful handwriting. Jamie got home safe, 1982 asterisk. Crystal, 6 months clean, 1990 asterisk. Marcus, reunited with grandmother, 1985 asterisk. Margaret felt tears streaming down her face before she realized she was crying. Gage found it first, hidden behind a loose brick in the foundation wall. A waterproof case, sealed tight against time and moisture. Inside, 3,000 Polaroids. Before and after shots of children who'd come through these doors desperate and left with hope. Names, dates, outcomes documented with the same careful attention Grizz had given to everything. And beneath the photos, wrapped in plastic, letters. Dozens of them. Handwritten thank yous from adults those children had become. You saved my life when I was 15. I was addicted, homeless, ready to die. You gave me food, a safe place to sleep, and helped me find my grandmother. I'm 52 now. I'm a social worker. I save kids because you saved me. Asterisk. I thought I was worthless. You told me I mattered. 27 years later, I'm a federal judge. I fight for kids nobody else wants because you fought for me. Asterisk. At the very bottom of the case, wrapped separately, $127,000 in cash. Old bills, carefully preserved. A note in Grizz's handwriting lay on top. Wrecker, if you're reading this, I'm gone. Use this money to keep helping. There's always more lost ones who need finding. Never stop. The world needs men who refuse to give up on people societies thrown away. Grizz asterisk. Margaret's phone rang then, the shrill sound cutting through the basement's silence like a gunshot. She pulled it from her purse with shaking hands. Only one person had this number. Bryn's voice came through panicked, breathless. Mom? Mom, where are you? Mom, listen to me. Preston Carver knows you bought the clubhouse. I heard him on the phone with someone. He's sending people tonight. Right now. You need to get out. Do you hear me? Get out now. The line went dead. Above them, gravel crunched under tires. Car doors slammed. Not motorcycles. SUVs. Multiple. Wrecker's face went pale in the flashlight beam. They're here. Heavy boots on the stairs above. A voice, amplified through a megaphone, cutting through the walls. Margaret Kane, you have 10 minutes to vacate the property before we enter by force. This is your only warning. Margaret's hands trembled as she gripped the waterproof case. Above them, footsteps multiplied, heavy boots crossing the main floor. Voices barking orders with military precision. We need to move, Wrecker hissed, already heading for the stairs. But Margaret stood frozen, staring at the Polaroids spread across the concrete. 3,000 faces. 3,000 children nobody else had wanted. 3,000 second chances that powerful men now wanted buried forever. Mrs. Kane. Gage's voice was urgent but gentle. We can get you out the back. There's an old service exit. No. Margaret's voice cut through the darkness with surprising force. This is my property. I have the deed. They can't just. A crash from upstairs. Something heavy hitting the floor. Wood splintering. They can and they will, Ratchet said flatly. These aren't cops following rules. These are hired muscle following orders. Margaret looked at the three bikers, saw the fear in their eyes. Not fear for themselves. Fear that Grizz's legacy would disappear. That 34 years of secret heroism would be erased like it had never existed. She thought about Bryn's voice on the phone. Panicked. Warning her. The first time in 2 years her daughter had sounded like she cared whether Margaret lived or died. Then Margaret thought about the locked door. The moving truck, being erased by her own blood. Nobody's taking this, she said, closing the waterproof case with a decisive snap. And nobody's taking my house. She walked toward the basement stairs, case held against her chest like armor. Ma'am, Wrecker started. You said this was sacred ground, Margaret said without turning around. You were right, and I won't let them desecrate it. She climbed the stairs, each step deliberate despite her hammering heart. Behind her, the three bikers exchanged looks. Then followed. Margaret emerged from the basement into chaos. The front door stood wide open, cold November air rushing through. 6 men in dark suits filled the main room, flashlights cutting through the darkness like weapons. 2 sheriff's deputies stood near the entrance, looking uncomfortable but present. And in the center of it all stood a man in an expensive charcoal suit. Mid-40s, sharp eyes that assessed everything with the cold calculation of someone who viewed people as problems to be solved or obstacles to be removed. Clayton Voss. She knew the type even before he spoke. The fixer. The man powerful people called when they needed something or someone to disappear. Margaret Kane. His voice was smooth, practiced, the kind of voice that sounded reasonable even while delivering threats. This is my property. Margaret's voice didn't waver. You're trespassing. Voss smiled. Didn't reach his eyes. Mrs. Kane, I represent interested parties who've identified serious code violations on this property. Structural integrity concerns. Health hazards. The county is prepared to condemn this building effective immediately. One of the deputies shifted uncomfortably. Young, maybe 30. He avoided Margaret's eyes. I have the deed, Margaret said. Purchased legally yesterday at county auction. You can't condemn it without proper inspection and notice. We have the authority to secure unsafe premises, Voss said, gesturing to the deputies. You have 10 minutes to collect your belongings and vacate. That's when Wrecker stepped forward from the basement doorway. Then Gage. Then Ratchet. 3 Hell's Angels, emerging from shadows like ghosts manifesting. Voss's men tensed immediately, hands moving toward jackets, toward weapons Margaret hoped they wouldn't use. This woman bought this property legally, Wrecker said quietly. You want to condemn it? You follow proper procedure. You get inspectors. You file paperwork. You don't show up at 2 in the morning with hired muscle and pretend it's official business. Voss's expression hardened. And who are you? Someone who knows what you're really after. Wrecker nodded toward the case Margaret held. And you're not getting it. The tension in the room crystallized. Dangerous. One wrong move from igniting into violence. That's when Margaret heard them. Engines. Multiple. Growing louder. Not cars. Motorcycles. Wrecker's phone had been in his hand the whole time, Margaret realized. He'd sent a message while they were still in the basement. Headlights flooded through the boarded windows. The rumble of Harley engines filled the night. 1, 5, 10, 15. More Hell's Angels. Older men now, 50s through 70s, but still brothers. They'd come when Wrecker called. Scattered across 3 states. Some hadn't seen each other in years. But when one brother sent an emergency call, you came. You always came. They formed a line between the clubhouse and Voss's vehicles. Chrome and leather and weathered faces that had seen harder fights than this. Men who'd lived through wars. Foreign and domestic, and survived by standing together. One of Voss's men moved toward the door. An older biker stepped in front of him. Didn't say a word. Didn't need to. Voss's jaw tightened. You're obstructing official county business. That's a crime. Then arrest us, the lead biker said calmly. He held up his phone, screen glowing. But know that I'm recording everything. And this video's already backed up to 3 different clouds. Whatever happens here, the world's gonna see it. The younger deputy cleared his throat. Mr. Voss, maybe we should. You'll do what you're paid to do, Voss snapped. The deputy's face flushed. He glanced at his partner, an older man with gray at his temples and the weary authority of someone who'd broken up too many fights and knew when to walk away. The sheriff met Margaret's eyes, saw something there that made him pause. An elderly woman clutching a waterproof case, surrounded by bikers, refusing to leave her own property. Mr. Voss, the sheriff said slowly, I think we need proper paperwork before proceeding. This isn't an emergency eviction situation. Are you refusing a direct order? I'm following the law, sir. Something seems irregular here. Voss's face went tight with barely controlled rage. He turned to Margaret, lowered his voice so only she could hear. You're making a serious mistake. That case you're holding? It contains stolen property, evidence that could destroy innocent lives. Hand it over now, walk away, and we'll forget this happened. Margaret met his eyes, saw the desperation behind the smooth exterior. The fear. These aren't innocent lives you're protecting, she said quietly. They're powerful ones. There's a difference. Voss leaned closer. You're 72 years old. Homeless. Your own daughter threw you out. You have nothing. No one. Who's going to believe you over a district attorney? Over business leaders and judges and senators? Something cold settled in Margaret's chest. The same feeling she'd had standing on the sidewalk watching Bryn drive away. But this time, she wasn't alone. I believe her, Wrecker said. So do we. The bikers outside echoed. Voss straightened, adjusted his tie. You have 48 hours before this property is condemned. The paperwork will be filed first thing Monday morning. And when you're arrested for possession of stolen documents, for trespassing on condemned property, for obstruction, He smiled, cold and predatory. Well, elderly women don't do well in jail, Mrs. Kane. Accidents happen. Tragic, but unavoidable. He turned to leave, his men following. The deputies went last, the younger one looking back, once with something like apology in his eyes. The motorcycles parted to let them through. Engines started. Vehicles pulled away, red taillights disappearing into the November darkness. But Margaret knew they'd be back. The bikers filed inside after Voss left. 15 men who'd dropped everything at Wrecker's call, who'd driven through the night to protect a woman they'd never met and a clubhouse that held memories they'd tried to forget. Margaret stood in the center of the room, still clutching the case, adrenaline finally draining and leaving her shaking. An older biker, silver beard, kind eyes, leather vest covered in patches from chapters across the country, approached her slowly. "Name's Preacher," he said gently. "Used to be Grizz's sergeant-at-arms. Kept order when things got rough." He gestured to the case. "That what I think it is?" Margaret nodded, unable to speak. Preacher's eyes glistened. 3,000 kids. 3,000, she confirmed. And Carver's one of them. He is. Preacher looked around at the assembled bikers. Battle-scarred men with kind eyes and rough hands and hearts that had somehow stayed soft despite everything the world had thrown at them. "We need to make this public," he said, "before they destroy it. Before they destroy you. They'll claim the photos are fake," Ratchet said. "Carver has resources. Connections. He'll bury this." "Not if we have witnesses," Wrecker said. He pulled out his phone, started scrolling. "I've kept loose track over the years. Some of those kids, the ones we saved, they're out there. Successful. Grateful. If they came forward, told their stories. You'd be asking them to expose the worst moments of their lives," Margaret said quietly. "To admit publicly they were runaways or addicts or abuse victims. For some of them, that could destroy careers, families, reputations. Same thing Carver's afraid of," Gage noted bitterly. Margaret moved to the bar, set the case down carefully, opened it. The Polaroids caught candlelight, 3,000 faces staring up at her. She thought about Bryn's phone call, the panic in her daughter's voice. Bryn worked for Carver, had built her career in his office. If this went public, Bryn would lose everything too. But if it didn't go public, Margaret would disappear. Another elderly woman who died alone and forgotten. Another person society had decided wasn't worth protecting. "We go public," Margaret said. Her voice was steady. "Final. Tomorrow morning. We contact every news station, every newspaper. We tell Grizz's story. We show them the proof." The bikers murmured agreement. Plans formed. Preacher knew a reporter at the state's largest newspaper. Ratchet had a contact at a TV station. They'd hold a press conference right here, in the clubhouse, surrounded by evidence. They worked through the night, cataloging photos, organizing documentation, preparing statements. Margaret watched the sun rise through gaps in the boarded windows, golden light cutting through darkness, hope bleeding into a space that had held too many secrets for too long. At 8 a.m., Wrecker's phone rang. His face went pale as he listened. He ended the call, looked at Margaret with something like horror in his eyes. "That was my buddy at the fire department. There's been a suspicious vehicle spotted near the property. He says," Wrecker's voice cracked. "He says if we're still here, we need to evacuate immediately." The smell hit them then. Faint but unmistakable. Gasoline. Preacher ran to the back of the building, threw open a door Margaret hadn't known existed. The garage was already burning. Flames crawled up the walls like living things, consuming decades of history in minutes. Smoke poured into the main clubhouse, thick and black and toxic. And across the road, barely visible in the morning light, a black SUV sat watching. "Waiting. We got 3 minutes before the whole building goes," Wrecker shouted. But Margaret was staring at the waterproof case on the bar. The basement. All those Polaroids still down there. The letters. The proof. The fire was spreading fast, already blocking the basement stairs. Margaret ran. Wrecker's hand clamped on Margaret's arm, yanking her back from the flames spreading across the clubhouse floor. You can't. The smoke alone will kill you before you reach the basement. Margaret twisted free, surprising strength in her 72-year-old frame. 3,000 children's faces are down there. They're proof. They're stories. I'm not letting them burn. The heat was already unbearable. Flames crawled up the wooden support beams like serpents, consuming everything Grizz had built, everything he'd protected for 34 years. If you believe some stories are worth dying for, hit that subscribe button right now. Like this video if you think courage has no age limit, because what happens next will prove that heroes come in the most unexpected forms. Gage stepped forward then, the one with stage 3 cancer, the one who had months left, maybe weeks. His face was set with the kind of calm that comes from having nothing left to lose. I'll go, he said simply. Gage, no. Wrecker started. I'm dying anyway, brother. Gage's voice was steady. Matter of fact. Let me matter. Let me do something that counts. He grabbed a leather jacket from the hook by the door, one of the old vests, heavy and thick, and dunked it in the sink behind the bar. Water still ran. Barely. He wrapped the soaking jacket around his head and shoulders. 60 seconds, he said to Wrecker. If I'm not back, you get her out. You get everyone out. You understand? Wrecker's jaw worked. Then he nodded, tears streaming down his weathered face. Gage ran into the flames. Margaret watched him disappear into smoke and fire. This man she'd known for less than 6 hours, risking everything for proof that other people had mattered. That children nobody wanted had been worth saving. The seconds stretched like hours. Smoke poured through the clubhouse now, thick and black, forcing everyone toward the exits. The bikers formed a chain, passing people out, making sure no one got left behind. 45 seconds, Preacher called, checking his watch. The flames roared louder. A support beam cracked with a sound like a gunshot. Part of the ceiling sagged. 60 seconds, Wrecker said, voice breaking. We have to go. Margaret, I'm sorry, we have to. Gage emerged from the basement. His jacket was on fire. His hands were blistered, red and raw, but he held the waterproof case against his chest like it was the most precious thing in the world. Which it was. He made it 3 steps before he collapsed. Margaret was moving before she thought. 30 years as a social worker had trained her for emergencies. She dropped to her knees beside Gage, checking his airway, his pulse. Smoke inhalation. Burns, but alive. She started CPR. Compressions. Counting. Breathing for him when his lungs wouldn't. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. Someone had called 911. Someone had seen the smoke. Gage's eyes fluttered open. He looked at Margaret, at the case she'd pulled from his arms and set safely aside, and smiled. Did good, he whispered. You did perfect, Margaret said, tears streaming down her soot-stained face. The paramedics arrived minutes later. They loaded Gage onto a stretcher, oxygen mask over his face, hands already working to stabilize him. The fire department attacked the blaze with controlled fury, but the garage was gone. Parts of the main building were consumed. The structure that had stood since 1968 was dying in front of them. Margaret stood in the gravel lot, wrapped in a blanket someone had draped over her shoulders, watching everything burn. The fire marshal approached after an hour. His face was grim. Arson. No question. We found accelerant poured along the garage walls. Whoever did this wanted to make sure nothing survived. He paused, looked at the waterproof case sitting at Margaret's feet. That what they were after? Yes. Must be important. It is, Margaret said. It's proof that good people existed. That's always important. The marshal studied her for a long moment. Then he pulled out his phone. I've got security footage from the traffic camera across the street. Shows an SUV sitting there for 20 minutes before the fire started. Got a partial on the license plate. Traces back to a shell company. He met her eyes. Shell companies registered to known donors of District Attorney Preston Carver's campaign fund. Margaret's breath caught. Ma'am, "I think you need to make some calls," the marshal said quietly. "Because this is bigger than property damage. This is attempted murder. And I'm guessing whoever ordered it has a lot to lose." By noon, 3 news vans had arrived. Preacher's reporter contact had brought her entire crew. The story was too big to ignore. Elderly woman targeted in arson attack. Hell's Angels' secret history of saving runaway children. District Attorney's desperate attempt to bury his past. Margaret sat on the tailgate of a pickup truck, still covered in soot, the waterproof case open beside her. Cameras rolled as she held up Polaroids, told Grizz's story, explained what 350 bikers had done for 34 years while the world called them monsters. Wrecker and the other angels stood behind her. Faces shown for the first time, no longer hiding. "We're not ashamed anymore," Wrecker said to the cameras. "We saved children when nobody else would. We gave them second chances. We proved that people written off as worthless can do extraordinary things. Let history judge us." Margaret showed Preston Carver's Polaroid then. 14 years old, terrified, running from a stepfather who'd beaten him until bones broke. "November 12th, 1987, she said clearly. Grizz pulled him off the streets, gave him food, shelter, safety, connected him with an aunt in another state who actually wanted him. Save his life." The camera zoomed in on the photo, on young Carver's face, on the date written in Grizz's careful handwriting. "Mr. Carver has built his career on being tough on crime," Margaret continued, "on demonizing motorcycle clubs and the people society calls undesirable. He's tried to bury proof that he was once one of those people, that men he now persecutes once saved his life." The story went viral within hours. Former runaways started coming forward. A state senator, a federal judge, a renowned artist, a trauma surgeon, all saved by Hell's Angels between 1975 and 2009, all willing now to tell their stories, to honor Grizz's memory by refusing to hide anymore. By evening, Preston Carver held a press conference, tried to deny everything, called it a fabrication, a political attack. Then Margaret showed his intake form from 1987, signed by Grizz, noting the injuries, the fear, the desperate need for help. Carver's face on screen went pale. He stammered, made excuses, claimed he didn't remember. "You told Grizz your stepfather was going to kill you," Margaret said to the cameras, though she was speaking directly to Carver. "He believed you. He saved you. And you repaid him by trying to erase his legacy, by sending men to burn down the clubhouse where he died, by ordering them to destroy proof that you were once vulnerable and human and in need of exactly the kind of compassion you now refuse to show others." Carver resigned within 24 hours. Clayton Voss was arrested for arson conspiracy and attempted murder. The shell company dissolved. The donors scattered. And Margaret Kane, the woman everyone had dismissed as too old to matter, became the face of a movement. 3 months later, Margaret stood on the front steps of a rebuilt structure. The insurance company had fought the claim initially. Arson meant no payout, but then donations started flooding in, from former runaways, from people who'd heard the story and wanted to help, from Angels chapters across the country who pooled resources to honor their fallen president. $340,000 in 2 weeks. Margaret used every cent to rebuild, not as a clubhouse this time, as something better. The sign above the door read, "Grizz House, where no one gets left behind." A halfway house for elderly people experiencing homelessness, for seniors who'd been discarded by families, by society, by a world that decided they were no longer valuable. 17 residents live there now, ages 67 through 84, all with stories of abandonment and resilience, all finding purpose again in a place that valued them. The Angels provided security, maintenance, companionship. Wrecker taught motorcycle mechanics in the rebuilt garage. Preacher ran support groups. Ratchet organized medical appointments and benefit applications. Gage had survived. Barely. The smoke inhalation combined with his cancer had put him in ICU for 2 weeks. But he'd made it. And now he lived at Griz's house, receiving treatment funded by donations, cooking meals for residents who'd become family. The walls still carried the original names, preserved and honored. 350 Hell's Angels who'd saved 3,000 children. Their legacy protected now, celebrated, and carved fresh into the wood above the fireplace. Margaret had added new names. Every resident who came through these doors. Every person who'd been thrown away and found their way back to Matching. The door opened behind Margaret. She turned to see Bryn standing there. Her daughter looked smaller somehow, humbled. She'd lost her job when Carver's office imploded. Lost her marriage when Kevin's embezzlement charges surfaced. Lost everything just like Margaret had. "Mom," Bryn said quietly, "I saw the news. About the house. About what you've built." Margaret waited. Didn't make it easy. "I was wrong," Bryn continued, voice breaking. "About everything. About you being a liability. About you not matching anymore. I threw away the strongest person I've ever known because I was too blind and selfish to see your worth." She paused, tears streaming. "Can we talk? Please." Margaret looked at her daughter, saw not the woman who'd locked her out, but someone struggling with her own shame and regret. Someone who'd lost everything and was learning what it felt like to be discarded. She thought about Griz's words, carved above the fireplace. "For those who ride into the storm, may they find shelter here." "Come inside," Margaret said finally. "There's always room for one more." 1 year after buying a broken house for $75, Margaret Kane stood on the porch watching the sun set over prairie grass turned gold with autumn. 23 residents now, all formerly homeless, all finding dignity again in a place that saw their worth. Wrecker sat beside her, both holding coffee. The documentary crew had just left. They were making a film about Griz's secret railroad, about 3,000 saved children and the bikers nobody believed could be heroes. "Think Grizz would be proud?" Margaret asked. Wrecker smiled. "Ma'am, you did what 350 of us couldn't. You made his legacy matter. You made us matter." Margaret thought about that morning a year ago. The locksmith's drill, the locked door, being told she was too much trouble, having $75 and nowhere to go. "You know what the difference is between being discarded and being free," she said quietly. "What's that?" "Nothing, except what you do next." Inside Griz's house, laughter echoed through rooms that once held secrets and now held hope. The walls carried names of heroes nobody had known existed. And Margaret Kane's name was carved there too. At 73, she'd learned what she'd somehow forgotten. You're never too old to matter. Never too broken to rebuild. Never too dismissed to stand up and prove everyone wrong. All it takes is $75, a broken house, and the courage to open the door.